Good evening. How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you on a Wednesday, Yom Revi'i. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house? On a Wednesday, Bill in Mid-Missouri, Yehud in South Carolina, Melissa in Great Neck, Joe in the Inland Empire, Lucy in Minnesota, Shendor in the Bronx, Belle in Texas, Bella in Florida, Nancy in North Carolina, Guy in Ohio, Paul in the Great Northwest, Karen in Northern California, Moishi in Brooklyn, Chaim in Florida, Ilanit in Silver Spring, Elise in Virginia, Lynn in Canada, Lester in Florida, and Marie in Freeport, New York. Welcome, everybody. Tonight's episode of AT Daily is sponsored by Rabbi Yehuda and Daniela Mintz, our dear friends, in honor of your good work. I guess they're talking to us, to me and Nina, but it's all of us in honor of your good work. And thank you so much, Rabbi Yehuda and Daniela, in the merit of this, enabling us to share more Torah with more people around the world. May you and all your loved ones be showered in blessings, and we say Amen. Tonight's daf, is page 11 here in a tractate Menachot, the 30th volume of the Talmud. We got a good head start on this daf yesterday, so that we're starting a new Mishna, Mishna number 3, here in chapter 1. Mishnah 3. About halfway down, maybe a little more than halfway down, page 11a. Mishnah 3. How does the priest perform the removal of a handful, right? The handful that he takes out of a meal offering. He extends his fingers onto the palm of his hand. If one increased its oil, decreased its oil, or decreased its frankincense beyond the appropriate measures, the meal offering is unfit. That's it. That's the whole Mishnah. Now the Gemara. What are the circumstances of a case where the meal offering is disqualified due to the fact that one increased its oil? Right? So the proportions are off. There's too much oil. But at what point does it become too much oil? Rabbi Eliezer says the circumstances are a case where he separated 2 log of oil for the meal offering instead of 1 log, and mixed them into 1/10 of an ephah of flour. And the Gemara raises a difficulty, and let Rabbi Eliezer interpret the Mishnah as referring to a case where he mixed non-sacred oil, or the oil of another meal offering, into the meal offering. Why is it only if he doubled the correct amount of oil? And if you would say that non-sacred oil and the oil of another meal offering do not disqualify a meal offering, well, Rav Zutra Bar Tovia objects to this. If that is so, then with regard to the meal offering of a sinner, of which it is stated on page 59b that oil disqualifies it because it comes with no oil, how can you find the circumstances where it is in fact disqualified if oil that doesn't belong there gets added and doesn't disqualify it? So Rav Zutra Bar Tovia explains, if you suggest that he mixed its own oil into the flour, such a case does not exist, as the meal offering of a sinner does not have any oil. And if he mixed non-sacred oil, or that of another meal offering, into the flour, the meal offering should not be disqualified, according to this view, as you said that such oil does not disqualify a meal offering. And if you would say that he designated oil for his meal offering and mixed it into the flour despite the Torah prohibition against mixing oil into it, I say, Rav Zutra Bar Tovia speaking, I say that since the meal offering of a sinner does not have oil at all, any oil that he separates and mixes into it is considered non-sacred. And you have already said that non-sacred oil does not disqualify a meal offering. According to this view, he's arguing against it because he's saying that the view doesn't make sense. So the Gemara responds, in fact, non-sacred oil and the oil of another meal offering do disqualify a meal offering. So then the next question is, well, why wasn't it mentioned in this Mishnah? And Rabbi Eliezer is speaking, utilizing the style of, it is not necessary, meaning, it is not necessary to say that non-sacred oil and the oil of another meal offering disqualify a meal offering. But in a case where one separated 2 log for his meal offering, since this first log is fit for the meal offering, and that second log is also fit for it, it's sacred, it was designated for this meal offering, one might say that even when he mixes both log into the meal offering, it would not disqualify the meal offering. Therefore, Rabbi Eliezer is teaching us that the meal offering is disqualified, right? The oil would be appropriate, but you put in too much. And the Gemara asks, and from where does Rabbi Eliezer derive this conclusion? Rav said the terminology of the Mishnah posed a difficulty for him. As one can ask, why does the Tana specifically teach that the meal offering is disqualified if he increased its oil, which indicates that he increased it with oil belonging to the offering itself? Let the Mishnah teach simply, he increased the oil. Rather, this is what the Mishnah teaches us, that even though he initially separated 2 log of oil for the meal offering, its own oil disqualifies the offering when there is too much of it. Now, the Gemara teaches that if one decreased its frankincense beyond its appropriate measure, the meal offering is unfit. Concerning this, the sages taught in a baraisa, if one decreased its frankincense to the point that the amount stood at only 1 pinch, then it is disqualified. But if the decreased amount stood at 2 pinches, it is fit. This is a statement of Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Shimon says, if the decreased amount stood at 1 pinch, it is fit. Less than that, it is disqualified. Right? So it's a very small amount of frankincense that has to be in there, depending on the opinion, either 2 pinches or 1 pinch. But if you get below that, okay, then you don't have enough frankincense and the offering would be disqualified. So the Gemara asks, but isn't it taught in a baraisa that Rabbi Shimon says a handful of flour or frankincense that was decreased by any amount from its full measure is disqualified? The Gemara answers that one should teach the baraisa as follows. A pinch of frankincense that was decreased by any amount is disqualified. And if you wish, say instead that here the first cited statement of Rabbi Shimon is referring to the case of frankincense that comes with a meal offering, and this frankincense is disqualified only when there is less than a pinch. Whereas there, the second statement of Rabbi Shimon is referring to the case of frankincense that comes by itself. Such frankincense is disqualified if it comprises any less than its full measure. Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Yosef says that Rabbi Yochanan says there are 3 disputes of Tanaim with regard to this matter. Rabbi Meir holds that the priest must remove a handful at the beginning, and ultimately the entire handful must be burned upon the altar. Now, this is the handful of flour that comes from the meal offering. And Rabbi Yehuda holds that the priest may remove a handful at the beginning, and ultimately at least 2 pinches from it must be burned on the altar. And Rabbi Shimon holds that the priest must remove a handful at the beginning, and ultimately at least 1 pinch must be burned on the altar. And all 3 of them interpret a single verse differently. The verse states, and he shall take up from there his handful of the fine flour of the meal offering, and of the oil of it, and all the frankincense that is upon the meal offering, and shall make it smoke upon the altar. So Rabbi Meir holds that one may not make the offering smoke upon the altar unless there remains the entire measure of frankincense that was initially mixed together with the meal offering. And Rabbi Yehuda holds that when the verse states all, it is referring to any part of the frankincense, even a single pinch, as kol can mean any amount. And when the verse states et, right, or es, this connecting word, doesn't mean anything on its own, but connects the verb to its object. in Hebrew, and and when the verse states et, this serves to include another pinch. So accordingly, at least 2 pinches must remain to be burned upon the altar. And Rabbi Shimon interprets the word all in the same manner as does Rabbi Yehuda, but he does not interpret and derive a law from the term et, and he therefore holds that only 1 pinch must remain to be burned. And Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Yosef further says that Rabbi Yochanan says the dispute between these Tanaim is with regard to frankincense that comes with a meal offering. But with regard to frankincense that comes by itself, everyone, even Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon, agree that the priest must bring a handful at the beginning, and ultimately the entire handful must be burned upon the altar. For this reason, it was necessary for the verse to state, that is upon the meal offering, as this indicates that, together with a meal offering, yes, one may burn the frankincense even if there remains only a pinch or 2, but with regard to frankincense that comes by itself, one may not burn it if it is not in that state. When does frankincense come by itself? Well, one example is the bowl of frankincense on the table of the shewbread in the sanctuary. On Shabbos, it's taken out from the sanctuary, and that bowl needs to be burned on the altar. So that would be an example of frankincense that comes by itself. I think also a person could make an offering of frankincense, but I'm not entirely sure about that. And Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Yosef says that Rabbi Yochanan says the dispute between these Tanaim is with regard to frankincense that comes with a meal offering. But with regard to frankincense that comes in bowls together with the shewbread, everyone, even Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon, agrees that there must be 2 handfuls in the beginning, 1 handful for each bowl, and ultimately there must also be 2 handfuls. Now the Gemara asks, isn't it obvious that this is the case, as with regard to this law, the verse does not state the term all, from which one might derive that it is referring to any part of the frankincense? So the Gemara explains, this ruling is necessary lest you say that since the frankincense in the bowls, from the table of the shewbread, comes together with the bread, i.e. the shewbread, it should be considered as frankincense that is upon the meal offering, and therefore Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon claim that one may sacrifice it even if less than 2 handfuls remain. And Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Yosef teaches us that this is not the case. The bowls of frankincense, they do accompany, a vegetarian item, right? The shewbread on the table, but it's not the frankincense with a meal offering. That's a different concept. The Gemara notes that Rabbi Ami and Rabbi Yitzchak Napacha disagree with regard to the case of frankincense that comes by itself. One says that the dispute between the Tanaim with regard to whether or not a handful of frankincense that became lacking may be sacrificed upon the altar applies only with regard to frankincense that comes with a meal offering. But with regard to frankincense that comes by itself, everyone agrees that the priest must remove a handful at the beginning, and ultimately the entire handful must be burned upon the altar. And one says, just as there is a dispute in this case, too, there is a dispute in that case. Next topic. The Mishna teaches that if the priest decreased the frankincense beyond its appropriate measure, the meal offering is unfit. So the Gemara infers from this statement that if he increased its frankincense, it is fit. It didn't say too much frankincense. It only talked about having too much oil. Can you have too much frankincense? The Gemara asks, but isn't it Tana Baraisa that if he increased its frankincense, the meal offering is disqualified? So Rami Bar Chama says the Baraisa rules that the meal offering is disqualified in a case where he separated 2 handfuls of frankincense for the meal offering and placed both of them into the meal offering. And Rabbi Bar Chama says, in a case where one separated 2 handfuls of frankincense for the meal offering and subsequently lost one of them, if it was lost before the removal of the handful of the meal offering, the additional frankincense was not fixed with the meal offering, and therefore it does not disqualify the meal offering. But if this occurred after the removal of the handful of the meal offering, since both handfuls were already fixed with the meal offering, that meal offering is disqualified, as he increased its frankincense by a large amount. It's too much. He wasn't mindful. He didn't do it correctly. As Rami Bar Chama says, in a case where one separated 4 handfuls of frankincense for placement in the 2 bowls that accompany the shewbread, and 2 of them were subsequently lost, the law depends on when they were lost. If they were lost before the removal of the bowls from the table of the shewbread, then the additional frankincense was not yet fixed with the shewbread, and the frankincense remains fit for sacrifice. But if they were lost after the removal of the bowls, then all 4 handfuls were already fixed with the shewbread, and therefore the frankincense becomes disqualified. The Gemara asks, why do I need this? Why do I also need this? This statement of Rami Bar Chama is identical to that previous statement, as the burning of the frankincense permits the shewbread for consumption by the priest, just as the frankincense permits the meal offering for consumption. Consequently, the removal of the bowls of frankincense is comparable to the removal of the handful from the meal offering. And the Gemara explains, the last statement of Rami Bar Chama is necessary, lest you say that since the handful of frankincense of the shewbread is already considered designated for burning, as it is placed in a separate bowl and burned in its entirety, then once the time arrives for removing the bowls from the table of the shewbread, it is considered as though the bowls were already removed, and the shewbread should therefore be disqualified on account of the additional frankincense. Therefore, Rami Bar Chama teaches us that the additional handfuls qualify the shewbread only if they were inside the bowls at the time of their actual removal from the table. And that concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 3. Here in chapter 1, we're going to move on and read the Mishnah, just the next Mishnah, Mishnah number 4. And we're actually almost done. It's a short class tonight, very short. So I'm just going to read the Mishnah, and we're going to leave the Gemara of Mishnah number 4 for tomorrow. Okay, Mishnah 4. With regard to one who removes a handful from the meal offering with the intent to partake of its remainder outside the temple courtyard, or to partake of an olive bulk of its remainder outside the temple courtyard, to burn its handful outside the temple courtyard, or to burn an olive bulk of its handful outside the temple courtyard, or to burn its frankincense outside the temple courtyard. In all these cases, the offering is unfit, but there is no liability for kares for one who partakes of it. If one had the intent to partake of its remainder on the next day, or to partake of an olive bulk of its remainder on the next day, to burn its handful on the next day, or to burn an olive bulk of its handful on the next day, or to burn its frankincense on the next day, then the offering is piggul, right? Because he had an intent at the outset to consume something beyond its time. And then one is liable to receive kares if he then ate of that meal offering which had been rendered piggul because of his intent to partake of some of it after its designated time, right? Whereas if he had intent to eat it outside of its designated place, right, that would render the offering unfit. But if he then went and ate some of it, that would not be a kares-bearing penalty, the way eating of something that is piggul is a kares-bearing penalty. Now we're at the top of 12a. Now this is the principle. In the case of anyone who removes the handful, or places the handful in the service vessel, or who conveys the service vessel with the handful to the altar, or who burns the handful on the altar, and during any of these rituals, any of these steps in the ritual, if he has intent to partake of an item whose typical manner is such that one partakes of it, right, to eat something that is normally eaten, for example, the remainder of a meal offering, or to burn an item whose typical manner is such that one burns it on the altar, right? That would be the handful. That is burned on the altar. Or, for example, the handful or the frankincense, which is also burned on the altar. But he had intent to do that outside of its designated place, then the meal offering is unfit, but there is no liability for kares. If his intent was to do so beyond its designated time, the offering is rendered piggul, and then if one ate of it, he would receive kares on account of it, provided that the permitting factor, i.e. the handful, was sacrificed in accordance with its mitzvah. Right? If you compound the error, if you both have an intent to eat outside, to eat beyond its time, and then you messed up burning the handful in some way, then if you ate of what would otherwise be a piggul offering, you would not be committing a kares bearing. You would not, be violating a prohibition that would result in kares, because it's no longer a piggul offering once you mess up another part of the procedure, for example, by burning it in the wrong place, or not burning it, or tameh priest burning it, etc. So if the permitting factor was sacrificed in accordance with its law, and you had intent to consume it beyond its time, that renders it piggul. And then if you ate of something that is piggul, that is the kares bearing prohibition violated. Now, how is the permitting factor not sacrificed in accordance with its mitzvah? If one removed the handful with intent to partake of the remainder, or burn the handful of frankincense outside its designated place, or he placed it in the vessel, conveyed it, and burned the handful on the altar with the intent to partake of the remainder beyond its designated time, right? So in other words, he's thinking about doing the handful beyond its time, and then what he actually does is have it, if he had two intents, right? If he had two intents to eat beyond its time and to burn the handful beyond its time. So if he had both of those intents, then then he would not have done the permitting factor according to its law, and therefore eating the part that would have otherwise been piggul is not eating piggul. And he placed it in the vessel, conveyed it, and burned the handful on the altar with the intent to partake of it, of the remainder outside its designated area. Or if one removed the handful and placed it in the vessel, conveyed it, and burned in the handful on the altar with the intent to partake of the remainder outside its designated area, that is a case of an offering whose permitting factor was not sacrificed in accordance with its mitzvah. Basically, if you made two mistakes, then you've taken it out of the realm of something that was otherwise fit, that you made it piggul with an intent as to one of its factors, and then you ate of that piggul offering, that would be a kares bearing penalty. But if you messed up two of these procedures, then it's no longer a piggul offering that you'd be eating. Now, the meal offering of a sinner and the meal offering of jealousy brought by a sota, the suspected adulteress, that one removed their handful not for their sake and placed it in the vessel, conveyed it, and burned the handful on the altar with the intent to partake of the remainder, or burn the handful beyond its designated time, or that one removed the handful with intent to partake of the remainder, or burn the handful beyond its designated time, or placed it in the vessel, conveyed it, and burned the handful on the altar not for their sake, or that one removed the handful and placed it in the vessel and conveyed it and burned the handful on the altar not for their sake, that is the case of an offering whose permitting factor was not sacrificed in accordance with its mitzvah. So that if you then ate of it, you violated some prohibition, but it's not going to be kares, a kares bearing prohibition. If one performed one of these rites with intent to partake of an olive bulk outside of its designated area, and an olive bulk the next day, or an olive bulk the next day and an olive bulk outside its designated area, or half an olive bulk outside its designated area and half an olive bulk the next day, or half an olive bulk the next day and half an olive bulk outside its area, the offering is unfit, but there is no liability for kares, because we're not going to combine minimum measures that are not met in order to meet a minimum measure and achieve violation of a prohibition that would result in kares. Rabbi Yehuda says that this is the principle. If the intent with regard to the time preceded the intent with regard to the area, the offering is piggul, and one is liable to receive kares on account of it. But if the intent with regard to the area preceded the intent with regard to the time, the offering is unfit, but there is no liability for kares. And the rabbis say, in both this case where the intent with regard to the time was first, and that case where the intent with regard to the area came first, the offering is unfit and there is no liability for kares because there were 2 errors made, and that's going to take it out of the realm of, having a mistake with respect to piggul, having an offering that is otherwise fit and offered, and then he ate the thing that was piggul. That would result in kares. But if you made 2 mistakes, 2 faulty intentions, it never was piggul, and eating it would not result in kares. It is an unfit offering, and in all these cases, if a person was obligated to bring that offering, he's going to have to bring another offering to satisfy his obligation. That is Mishnah number 4 here in chapter 1, and that's where we will stop and continue tomorrow. I am not seeing any questions, and therefore, we're done. So, God willing, see you tomorrow, Thursday, regular Thursday time, 6 p.m. Pacific. Have a great night.